A simple bump turns into a tense face-off, uncovering hidden judgments and testing the courage of two strangers. See how one moment of standing up changes everything, leaving a woman to face the impact of her actions. Don't miss this powerful story. Subscribe now for daily thought-provoking tales that inspire change and reflection. Join us in sharing stories that matter every single day. Marcus, a black man in his 30s, stood outside a bustling cafe, sipping his coffee and glancing at his watch now and then, waiting patiently for his friend. He was dressed neatly, carrying himself with a quiet confidence that made him blend effortlessly into the crowd, even as the city moved busily around him. Just then, Claire, a white woman in her 40s, rushed down the sidewalk, her arms weighed down by several shopping bags. Her face was tight with impatience, eyes darting around as if she was perpetually annoyed with everything and everyone in her path. She was walking briskly, not paying much attention to where she was going, and in her hurry she collided directly into Marcus, spilling his coffee all over his shirt. Startled by the sudden bump, Marcus instinctively took a step back, glancing down at his shirt and then back up at Claire. Despite the inconvenience, he managed a polite smile and said softly, "Oh, no worries. Just a little coffee spill. Happens." But Claire barely glanced his way, her face twisting into a scowl as if she were somehow offended by his very presence. She let out an annoyed huff, muttering, "Why don't people just pay attention?" Her tone was dismissive, almost as if she saw herself as above any need for politeness. Marcus heard her muttering and, keeping his calm, responded, "Excuse me," in a soft but clear tone, trying to clarify if he had heard her correctly. This only seemed to further irritate Claire. She turned to him with a hardened expression, her voice raising slightly as she snapped, "Yes, excuse you. Maybe if you weren't in the way." Her words were sharp, dripping with condescension, as if she expected him to stand there and take her anger without question. Marcus kept his voice calm, though the insult was clear. "I have every right to be here just like anyone else," he replied, meeting her gaze steadily. He didn't want a confrontation, but he also couldn't ignore her open disrespect. Instead of backing down, Claire crossed her arms and gave him a look of disdain. "Is that so?" she retorted, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I don't know what gives you that idea, but I'm telling you to get out of my way." Her words were cold and dismissive, as if she believed herself entitled to decide who could occupy the space around her. Marcus took a steadying breath, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. He had encountered people like her before, people who seemed to view him as less, who thought he didn't deserve the same respect as anyone else. He wondered why she couldn't see him as a person, why her anger seemed so rooted in something deeper, something uglier. The crowd around them grew slightly larger, sensing the tension and drawn by the harshness of Claire's voice. A few people exchanged glances, some with looks of discomfort, others with silent disapproval. Ignoring the quiet judgment from the onlookers, Claire continued, her voice becoming louder, angrier. "People like you," she spat, repeating her phrase with more venom. "You think you can do whatever you want, walk wherever you want, without considering others." Her words sliced through the air, meant to belittle, to diminish. Marcus felt each one, but he held on to his dignity, refusing to let her anger define him. "I think we should both just move on," Marcus suggested, his tone gentle but firm. He wanted peace, a way to end the conversation with his head held high. But his calmness seemed to irritate Claire even more. She took his suggestion as defiance, as if he were challenging her authority. "Oh, you think you're going to tell me what to do now?" she snapped, her face twisting with disdain. Her eyes flashed with an intensity that Marcus recognized, a refusal to see him as anything more than the stereotypes in her mind. Marcus looked around, noticing the uncomfortable faces in the crowd, the tension growing thick. He realized this was no longer just about him and Claire. People were watching, bearing witness to the prejudice unfolding before them. He knew he couldn't simply walk away without letting her know that her words, her attitude, were unacceptable. He looked back at Claire, meeting her gaze without fear. "Respect goes both ways," he said, his voice steady and filled with quiet strength. "Maybe it's time you remembered that." Claire's face turned red, her anger boiling over at his words. For a moment there was silence, a charged quiet as they stood locked in a standoff. Then, without warning, she lifted her hand and slapped him across the face, the sound of it echoing in the silence. The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock spreading among the onlookers. Claire took a step back, breathing heavily, as if she couldn't believe what she'd just done. But instead of feeling victorious, she seemed taken aback, almost as if she hadn't expected to take it that far. Marcus held his ground, his expression a mix of hurt and determination. He knew this moment was bigger than just the two of them. The slap stung Marcus's face, not just from the physical impact, but from the humiliation that came with it. Claire stood there, her hands still raised slightly as if she was frozen in the act, her expression a mix of anger and shock. For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Marcus looked at her, his face calm, but his eyes reflecting the hurt and disbelief of being struck. He knew she felt justified, that somewhere in her mind, she believed she had the right to hit him simply because she didn't like the way he responded to her anger. The crowd around them murmured, their whispers filled with surprise and judgment, but no one stepped forward, and the tension hung thick in the air. Claire's eyes flickered to the people around her, noticing their stares for the first time. It was as if she suddenly realized that her actions had consequences, that her anger was not going to be met with silent agreement. She looked back at Marcus, her face flushed, and a strange flicker of uncertainty passed over her features. But still, she refused to admit fault, her pride too thick to let her back down. "Maybe now you'll learn to stay in your place," she sneered, her words sharp and meant to cut deep. She was trying to regain control of the situation, trying to make it seem like she was the one who had been wronged. Marcus felt a surge of emotions rise within him, hurt, anger, but also a deep sense of resilience. He'd dealt with people like Claire before, people who felt entitled to look down on him, to treat him as less simply because of who he was. But today was different. Today he was standing in front of a crowd that had witnessed every word, every insult, every act of disrespect. He knew that walking away in silence would mean accepting the slap as something he deserved, something he had to tolerate. But he also knew that responding with anger, with the same hatred Claire showed him, would make him lose himself. He took a deep breath, grounding himself, and looked Claire in the eye. "I don't deserve this," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "I don't deserve to be treated like this by anyone, including you." His words were simple, but they held a power that was undeniable. The crowd around them grew silent, their eyes on Marcus, their expressions showing a mix of admiration and empathy. For the first time, Claire seemed at a loss for words. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was as if Marcus's response had stripped her of the authority she'd claimed over him, forcing her to confront the reality of her actions. In her frustration, Claire tried to regain control, stepping closer to Marcus with a sneer. "You don't get to talk to me like that," she hissed, her voice low and filled with venom. But Marcus stood his ground, his gaze steady, his expression one of quiet strength. "Respect is something everyone deserves," he replied, his voice unwavering. "It doesn't matter who you are or what you think of me. I have as much right to be here as anyone else." His words echoed in the silence, cutting through the anger that had clouded the air. The crowd shifted slightly, murmuring their approval, and for the first time, Claire seemed truly uncomfortable. Seeing that her usual tactics were not working, Claire's face twisted with frustration. She looked around, as if searching for someone to back her up, someone to agree with her and validate her actions. But all she saw were judgmental stares, faces reflecting disappointment and disapproval. Her sense of superiority, which had felt so solid only moments ago, now seemed fragile, crumbling under the weight of her actions. Realizing this, she began to feel the pressure of the crowd's gaze, the silent condemnation that seemed to pierce through her pride. Desperate, she turned back to Marcus, her tone growing defensive. "You provoked me," she said, almost pleadingly, as if trying to convince herself as much as the people around her. "You stood in my way, acted like you could just do whatever you wanted. You forced my hand." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear beneath her bravado. But Marcus didn't waver. He knew her words were nothing more than an excuse, an attempt to justify her actions to herself and to the crowd. "I didn't force you to do anything," Marcus replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You chose to act this way. You chose to hit me, to insult me, to try and make me feel less than you. That was your choice, not mine." His words were a mirror, reflecting back at her the reality of what she had done. Claire's face reddened as his words sank in, and for the first time, she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The crowd watched her, their expressions filled with silent disapproval, and the weight of their judgment began to settle on her shoulders. In a final act of defiance, Claire attempted to regain control one last time, her voice dripping with contempt. "People like you always think you're the victim," she sneered, her tone bitter and defensive. But her words felt hollow, lacking the conviction she had displayed before. The crowd had seen too much, had heard too much, and they were no longer willing to accept her version of events. The murmurs grew louder, a few voices openly supporting Marcus, voicing their disapproval of Claire's actions. Sensing that the tide had turned, Marcus took one last look at Claire, his expression a mix of sadness and strength. He didn't need to say anything more. His silence was enough, a powerful statement of his dignity and self-respect. Claire, faced with the reality of her actions and the rejection of the crowd, took a step back, her face pale and filled with uncertainty. She seemed smaller now, her confidence shattered by the strength of the truth. And as she stood there, surrounded by a crowd that no longer saw her as superior, she began to understand the consequences of her actions, the impact of her prejudice laid bare for all to see. The slap had left a sting on Marcus's face, not only physically but emotionally. He felt the weight of it, not just as a hit but as a reminder of all the disrespect he'd faced quietly over the years. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the silence around him heavy with expectation. Claire stood there, her expression somewhere between satisfaction and disbelief, as if she still couldn't believe she'd actually gone that far. But Marcus refused to let her see any weakness. He wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself, holding back the anger and sadness that swelled inside him. Without raising his voice, he looked directly at Claire and said, "I don't deserve to be treated like this. No one does." His voice was calm but filled with a firmness that made the crowd around them listen even more intently. His words hung in the air, clear and simple, but powerful enough to cut through the tension. For the first time, Claire seemed to falter slightly, as if his words had caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to speak but couldn't seem to find the right words, her confidence cracking. In her frustration, she sneered, trying to maintain control. "Oh, so now you're going to lecture me? After you stood there, getting in my way, acting like you could do whatever you want?" Her tone was defensive, her words dripping with bitterness, as though she were trying to cling to some shred of authority. But Marcus remained steady, his gaze never wavering from hers. He felt no need to defend himself. Instead, he simply responded, "All I did was stand here. You chose to see me as a problem. That's on you, not me." His response seemed to unsettle her even more. She took a small step back, her face turning red as she glanced at the crowd, hoping to find support in their faces. But all she saw were expressions of silent disapproval, people shaking their heads, their eyes filled with judgment. The realization began to dawn on her that she was not the victim here, that the crowd was on Marcus's side, not hers. She looked back at him, her voice trembling slightly as she attempted to regain her footing. "You think you can just stand there and act innocent?" "You provoked me," she insisted, her voice sounding hollow, even to herself. Marcus took a steadying breath, feeling a mix of sadness and strength welling up inside him. He didn't want to respond in anger. He knew that would only give her an excuse, a reason to twist the situation to fit her narrative. Instead, he spoke with quiet conviction, his words filled with a kind of sadness that everyone around could feel. "I didn't provoke you, and you know it. You saw me standing here, and you chose to see me as less, as someone you could push around. But that doesn't make it true. I am just as deserving of respect as anyone else." His words were simple, clear, but they carried a weight that seemed to press down on Claire, forcing her to confront the reality of her actions. She could feel the crowd's eyes on her, the silent condemnation in their stares. Her face grew pale, and her hands shook slightly as she tried to hold on to the last bits of her pride. You, you don't get to talk to me like that, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she were grasping at straws. But the strength in Marcus's gaze, the dignity in his words, had left her without ground to stand on. A few voices in the crowd spoke up, murmuring words of support for Marcus, calling out Claire's behavior. She looked around, realizing that she was alone in her prejudice, that no one was willing to stand with her in this moment. It was as if the very foundation of her confidence had been shattered, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and, for the first time, truly uncomfortable. She took another step back, her expression one of desperation, as she tried to maintain the last remnants of her composure. Marcus, seeing her discomfort, felt no need to continue. He had said what he needed to say, and he knew that his silence now would be more powerful than any further words. He simply looked at her, a look of quiet strength and resolve, letting her feel the weight of the truth she had tried so hard to deny. The crowd watched in silence, a few people nodding in respect for his composure, admiring his ability to stand up for himself without resorting to anger or aggression. Claire's face fell, her expression now one of defeat. She looked away, unable to meet Marcus's gaze, the shame beginning to settle in as she realized the depth of her actions. She had expected to walk away feeling powerful, justified in her anger, but instead she felt small, exposed. She glanced at the crowd, hoping for some sign of sympathy, but all she found were looks of disappointment, of people who had seen her for who she truly was in that moment. And it was a truth she could no longer deny. As the crowd remained silent, Marcus turned to walk away, his steps calm and purposeful. He didn't need to look back to know that he had made his point. His dignity, his quiet strength, had spoken louder than any anger or retaliation ever could. And as he walked away, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had not allowed her prejudice to define him, that he had risen above it. Claire watched him go, feeling the weight of the consequences she had brought upon herself. And in that silence, surrounded by a crowd that no longer looked up to her, she finally understood the impact of her actions. As Marcus turned and began to walk away, Claire stood there, stunned and unable to move. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in, and her sense of superiority started to crumble. She had expected Marcus to back down, to walk away quietly like he didn't matter. But he hadn't. Instead, he had stood there with strength, dignity, and calm, leaving her to face the weight of her own actions. For the first time, Claire felt small, her confidence shattered in front of the crowd that had once been mere bystanders. She looked around, hoping to find at least one face that would offer her understanding or sympathy, someone who might agree with her. But all she saw were expressions of disappointment and judgment. The people who had witnessed the entire exchange saw her now, not as the victim she had tried to present herself as, but as the aggressor, the one who had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. Their silent disapproval was almost louder than any words they could have spoken, pressing down on her, forcing her to confront what she had done. Claire's hands shook slightly, and her face turned pale as she realized the impact of her actions. She opened her mouth to speak, wanting to defend herself, to find some way to excuse her behavior. But no words came. Her excuses felt weak, flimsy, even to herself. She could hardly believe that she had gone so far as to hit someone, to try and publicly humiliate a man who had done nothing wrong. And now, instead of feeling powerful or justified, she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she had never experienced before. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "You had no right to treat him that way," she said, looking directly at Claire. Her words weren't loud, but they held a strength that Claire couldn't ignore. Another man nodded, adding, "Respect goes both ways. You can't expect it if you're not willing to give it." Their words, so simple yet so true, struck Claire deeply, breaking through the layers of denial she had tried to wrap around herself. Claire's heart pounded as she absorbed their words, realizing that they were right. In her mind, she had believed herself to be better, to deserve more respect than others simply because of who she was. But now, standing there in front of this crowd, she saw herself through their eyes, someone who had allowed her pride and prejudice to take control, someone who had chosen to hurt another person out of anger and entitlement. A wave of shame washed over her as she recalled the harsh words she had used, the slap she had given Marcus without a second thought. She remembered his calm, steady gaze, the way he had held on to his dignity even when she had tried to tear it down. He hadn't reacted with anger or hate. He had simply shown her that he deserved respect as much as anyone else. And in doing so, he had forced her to confront the uncomfortable truth about herself. She glanced back at Marcus, who was now almost out of sight, walking away with the same calm and confidence that had unsettled her so deeply. She wanted to call out to him, to apologize, to say something that might undo the damage she had done. But the words stuck in her throat, weighed down by the realization that an apology wouldn't erase what had happened, wouldn't make things right. The damage was already done, and now she was left with the consequences. As she stood there, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their interest fading as they returned to their day, but not without a final look of disappointment in her direction. Claire felt their judgment linger even as they walked away, a reminder of the impact of her actions that wouldn't easily fade. She was left standing alone, her confidence shattered, her pride humbled by the truth that she had been forced to confront. In the quiet that followed, Claire finally understood the weight of her prejudice, the harm it had caused, not just to Marcus but to herself. She realized that she had allowed her own assumptions and insecurities to define her actions, that she had hurt another person out of a misguided sense of superiority. And as she stood there alone and exposed, she felt the heavy burden of shame settle over her, a reminder that respect and dignity were not privileges to be given or taken away. They were rights that everyone deserved. For the first time, Claire felt the need to look inward, to question the beliefs that had led her to this moment. She knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, that confronting her own flaws would be uncomfortable and challenging. But as she took a deep breath, she resolved to start, to make a change, however small, to become someone worthy of the respect she had once demanded but never truly earned. And though she had lost a sense of the power she had clung to so tightly, she felt a faint glimmer of hope, the beginning of a path toward a better understanding of herself and others. As Claire stood there in the aftermath of her actions, the reality of what she had done settled over her heavily. She looked at the faces of the crowd, who were no longer just passive onlookers, but witnesses to everything that had transpired. Their expressions told her all she needed to know. They weren't on her side. She had expected them to understand, to see things her way, but now she could see the disappointment and disapproval in their eyes. The very people she thought might sympathize with her were silently judging her, and it felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting. A young woman in the crowd stepped forward, her face a mix of sadness and disappointment. "You really think it's okay to treat someone like that?" she asked softly, her gaze steady and unyielding. Claire opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She felt her usual defenses falter as the woman continued. "He didn't deserve any of that. No one does." The woman's words were simple, but they pierced through Claire's pride, leaving her feeling more vulnerable than ever. Another voice spoke up, this time a man from the back of the crowd. "You can't expect respect when you're not willing to give it," he said, shaking his head. His tone was calm but firm, as if he were stating an undeniable truth. Claire looked down, the weight of his words pressing on her. She had always expected respect from others, had always believed herself to be deserving of it. But in this moment, she realized that respect wasn't something she could demand without offering it in return. As more people in the crowd murmured their agreement, Claire felt her sense of control slipping away completely. She had spent her life believing she was better, that she deserved more. But now she could see that those beliefs had only isolated her, made her a stranger to the very people she wanted to impress. The faces around her showed no sympathy, no understanding, only disappointment in the actions she had chosen to take. Someone else in the crowd muttered, "You can't treat people like they're less and expect them to just take it." Claire's heart pounded as the words sank in. She knew they were right. She had acted out of anger, out of a sense of superiority, and now she was facing the consequences. The crowd had seen her for who she was in that moment, and she couldn't hide from their judgment. Her actions had spoken louder than any defense she could offer. Claire glanced around, her gaze meeting eyes filled with silent reproach. She felt exposed, like every flaw, every prejudice she'd ever held, was on display for the world to see. She had once felt powerful, confident in her ability to assert her will over others, but now she felt small, stripped of the authority she had taken for granted. She was no longer in control. She was simply another person who had been called out for her behavior. A quiet voice in the crowd said, "Maybe this will teach her to think twice next time." Claire's face burned with shame. She knew there was no excuse for what she had done, that her anger and pride had blinded her to the harm she was causing. She could see now how wrong she had been, how deeply she had hurt someone who had shown her nothing but calm and respect. And as she stood there feeling the silent judgment of the crowd, she realized that she could no longer ignore the truth. In the midst of the murmurs, someone placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and she looked up, expecting to see a face of sympathy. Instead, she met the eyes of an older woman who looked at her with a mix of sadness and disappointment. The woman didn't say a word, but her gaze held a message that Claire couldn't ignore. It was as if the woman's eyes were telling her that it was time to change, to let go of the pride and prejudice that had led her down this path. Claire swallowed hard, her heart heavy with regret. She felt the shame of her actions, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her like a stone. She wanted to apologize, to take back everything she had said and done, but she knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. She had crossed a line, and now she would have to live with the consequences. As the crowd began to disperse, their whispers fading into the background, Claire was left standing alone, feeling the emptiness of her actions settle over her. She had spent her life believing she was above others, that she deserved more simply because of who she was. But now she saw that her beliefs had only left her isolated, disconnected from the very people she wanted to impress. And in this moment, she understood that respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned through kindness, humility, and understanding. With a deep breath, Claire began to walk away, her steps heavy with the weight of everything she had just experienced. She knew that this moment would stay with her, that it would serve as a reminder of the importance of empathy, of the need to treat others with the same respect she had always expected for herself. And though she couldn't undo the past, she resolved to start making a change, to become someone worthy of the respect she had once demanded without question. As Claire walked away, each step felt heavier than the last. The weight of her actions hung over her, filling her with a shame she couldn't shake. She had started this day feeling strong, confident in her own sense of superiority, but now she felt broken, her pride shattered. For the first time, she had been forced to see herself through the eyes of others, and what she saw left her deeply unsettled. She couldn't stop thinking about Marcus's words, the calm and dignity in his voice as he stood his ground. He hadn't raised his voice or lashed out. He had simply held on to his respect and humanity, something she had tried so hard to strip from him. The more she reflected on it, the more she realized how much she had lost in that moment, not only in the eyes of the crowd, but also in her own sense of self. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and more than anything, alone. As she walked down the sidewalk, her mind raced, going over every detail of the encounter. The way the crowd had turned on her, the disappointment in their faces, and the calm strength in Marcus's words, these memories replayed in her mind, each one leaving a mark. She knew she couldn't ignore this. Her actions, her anger, her pride, they were all part of a problem she could no longer deny. She had allowed her own beliefs to blind her, to make her feel entitled to disrespect someone else simply because of who they were. A wave of guilt washed over her as she thought about all the moments she had dismissed others, thinking herself better, more deserving. She realized now that her sense of superiority had been nothing but a mask, something to hide behind, a way to make herself feel powerful. But now that mask had been stripped away, leaving her to face the truth of who she had become. She had chosen anger over understanding, judgment over kindness, and now she was left to deal with the consequences of those choices. Claire took a deep breath, feeling a knot in her chest. She understood now that respect was not a privilege to be given or taken away at her will. Respect was something that everyone deserved, something that couldn't be demanded but had to be earned through kindness and humility. She thought back to Marcus, to the quiet strength he had shown, and for the first time, she felt a sense of admiration. Despite everything, he had held on to his dignity, showing her a kind of strength she had never known. A part of her wanted to turn back, to find Marcus and apologize, to somehow make things right. But she knew that an apology wouldn't erase what had happened, wouldn't change the hurt she had caused. She couldn't undo the past, but she could choose a different path forward. She could let this moment become a turning point, a chance to reflect and grow, to become someone worthy of the respect she had once demanded so easily. With each step, Claire began to feel a new resolve growing within her. She would take this experience as a lesson, a reminder that her actions had real consequences, not just for others but for herself. She would no longer allow her pride or prejudice to control her, to make her feel entitled to look down on others. Instead, she would start to look inward, to confront the beliefs that had led her down this path, to question the assumptions she had always taken for granted. In the quiet of her own thoughts, Claire found a sense of purpose, a determination to change, to become a better person. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that confronting her own flaws would be uncomfortable, even painful, but she also knew that this was a journey worth taking, a chance to rebuild herself from the ground up. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she felt a faint glimmer of hope, a hope that one day she could become someone she could be proud of, someone who could face the world with kindness, empathy, and understanding. As Claire continued her walk, the echoes of the encounter lingered in her mind. She understood now that true strength came not from pride or entitlement, but from humility, from the ability to see others as equals. She knew the journey ahead would be difficult, a path of self-reflection and growth. But she also knew it was a journey she had to take. She was determined to change, to let this experience reshape her into a person who treated others with the kindness and respect everyone deserved. Meanwhile, Marcus walked away with his head held high, a quiet strength in his steps. He had stood his ground with dignity, showing Claire and everyone watching that respect was something no one could take from him. His calm, powerful response had left a lasting impact, not just on Claire, but on everyone who had witnessed it. Thank you for watching. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe and join us daily for more thought-provoking and real-life stories that inspire change. Your support means everything to us, and together we can share stories that make a difference. See you tomorrow for another impactful story.